Good morning, my name is Andrew Gibb, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Theater and Dance here at Tech. My talk today is taken from a book I'm finishing with the support of the Humanities Center. It's titled Rehearsing California, Californios, Anglos, and the Performative Fashioning of the U.S. West. There's an interesting scene in the 1960s. There's an interesting scene in the 1956 film Giant, in which Elizabeth Taylor, playing ranch wife Leslie Benedict, is barred from a discussion of men's stuff by her husband and his all-male inner circle of fellow landowners and local politicians. The idea that the matriarch of a powerful Texas ranching family would be excluded from the political discussions that affected her no doubt seems odd to those of us in West Texas familiar with such towering figures of ranching history as Cornelia Adair, owner of the J.A. Ranch, or with her modern inheritor, Nina Ritchie. There's Miss Ritchie there on the bottom right with representatives of our own Southwest collection. And what of the sisters Helen DeWitt Jones and Christine DeWitt, who so lastingly influenced the educational and artistic life of Lubbock? In my talk today, I'd like to advance the idea that the social and political power of the real-life elite Western women is connected to the historical prominence of powerful family dynasties, many of them connected to ranching, a phenomenon that can be traced back to the Mexican era of the Far West. An example of this Mexican heritage of powerful Western females, I share the story of Doña Angustias de la Guerra, a Californiana, or Mexican Californian woman, who not only ran a small ranching kingdom, but who, more importantly, played a major role in the political forging of the U.S. state of California, which, together with Texas, bookended the 19th century U.S. encompassment of the North American Far West. By the time California became part of the United States in 1848, most of its prime productive land was already in the hands of private individuals. This is a map of Mexican land grants showing how much of California was already taken when Americans arrived. As a result, Californian cultural patterns had a significant impact on the shape of what was to become a U.S. Western society. Most important among those Mexican inheritances was a political system dominated by oligarchs, a small group of powerful elites defined by wealth and family connections. Those elite Mexicans, I argue, taught the Anglos who replaced them a certain style of leadership and oligarchic performance, we might say. Such performance was key to the influence that one of those elites, Angustias de la Guerra, had on the California Constitutional Convention, the body that met in 1849 to decide on how a new U.S. California would be organized. Doña María de las Angustias Josefa Antonio Bernabé de la Guerra was born in 1815 into the first family of Santa Barbara, California. At age 18, she married Manuel Jimeno Casarín, whose political career in Mexican California included terms as a legislator, secretary of state, and acting governor. Thus, for the first 30 years of her life, de la Guerra moved within the most rarefied power circles of Mexican California. Reared in elite households, Californianas like Angustias were trained in the skills necessary to do their part in maintaining local oligarchic power. Those talents included many that were common to other European and American elite women at the time: polite conversation and a good fashion sense, as well as a whole range of graceful movements, including social dance. But the education of young Californianas included subjects not often found in the schooling of their elite Euro-American sisters. The power of Mexican California's oligarchs was based upon their monopolization of ranching land, a market they cornered through strong kinship networks amongst landowners. If they were to maintain their power, women had to be afforded robust property rights. They needed to be able to inherit land from their deceased husbands. This necessitated legal protections for women, but also their training in the leadership skills necessary to maintain and protect large landholdings. By all accounts, Angustias de la Guerra proved an apt pupil of both of the social and the vocational education offered to the elite daughters of California. While it is true that the exercise of power by Californianas did not extend to elected or appointed governmental positions, de la Guerra's story indicates the extent to which the elite Mexican California women could and did contribute to the political shaping of their native land. Throughout her husband's political career, Angustias acted as his unofficial secretary, trusted with even the most delicate documents. She even took charge of his social arrangements, frequently hosting parties for foreign diplomats. When California was seized by U.S. forces during the U.S.-Mexico War of 1846-48, De la Guerra was deeply resentful, but her shrewd political sense kept her from declaring publicly for one side or the other. Over the course of the wartime occupation, she alternatively harbored fugitive Californios and nursed sick U.S. officers. When California was ceded to the United States at the end of the war, she buried her bitter feelings and immediately began to pursue political alliances with the leaders of the military government. Those friendships would shortly pay off when the delegates of the state constitution came to Monterey in 1849. Angustias shared a large adobe mansion with her husband in Monterey. And here's a photograph of that house in later years when it had fallen into disrepair. Angustias gladly offered the use of her home to her brother Pablo de la Guerra, and in so doing made her house the home base of the Californio contingent of the convention. She immediately began hosting dinners, dances, and other social events, making sure to invite prominent Anglo delegates. In no time, her home became, in the words of one observer, quote, the favorite resort of all the leading members, both American and Californian, unquote. It is through those moments of social diplomacy that we can observe De la Guerra exercising the tangential political power available to elite Californianas. Growing up in the home of her parents, Don Jose de la Guerra and Maria Antonio Carrillo, perhaps the most famed hosts of Mexican California, young Angustias had learned early the political value of a good party. Such events were the primary performative mechanisms through which the oligarchy of Mexican California constituted and perpetuated itself. Music, dancing, dining, polite conversation, and the presence of eligible heirs and heiresses were the hallmarks of the elder De la Guerra's gatherings, and all of those elements were noted in later years by the guests of their daughters' Monterey parties. Angustias clearly had studied at the feet of two of the region's masters of socio-political maneuvering. De la Guerra's hosting skills paid considerable dividends for her fellow Californios at the Constitutional Convention. For the oligarchic dons of what had recently been Mexican California, two of the most critical subjects of debate were those of women's property rights, necessary to maintain the region's great landed estates, and that of taxation, which threatened to beggar the land-rich but cash-poor California ranchers. Both of those questions were ultimately decided in favor of the landed oligarchs. And although there is no evidence that explicitly links the outcomes of those key votes to the social events at the De la Guerra adobe, a number of indirect proofs can be offered. The first is the frequent glowing mention of Angustias' parties in the diaries and memoirs of the convention attendees. Those who seemed most impressed were the Anglo delegates, who one might expect would be those set most against the established California power elites. Comments made on the convention floor also hint at the influence of Doña Angustias' social season. When the subject of women's property rights came up, a contentious debate arose between those who wanted to continue the ownership rights of Californianas and those who wanted to institute Anglo common law, by which a woman's land became the property of her husband upon marriage. Those who supported Anglo law feared that should a man marry a richer woman, he would be unnaturally dependent upon her. One representative of Mr. Botts rhetorically asked, quote, "Would you, in short, make Prince Alberts of us all?" referring to Queen Victoria's prince consort. On the other side of the debate, Henry Halleck rose in support of a motion that would guarantee women's property rights. He offered a comment that historians have tended to interpret as little more than a bit of levity intended to lighten the mood. He said, "Having some hopes that someday or other I may be wedded, I shall advocate this section in the Constitution, and I would call upon all of the bachelors in the convention to vote for it. It is the very best provision to get us wives we can introduce into the Constitution." In other words, Halleck was half seriously suggesting that if Californianas were allowed to continue owning their own land, there would be a lot more rich Californias around to marry. Humor aside, Halleck had many a times visited Doña Angustias' home in the company of fellow Anglo bachelors, where they likely met many an unmarried daughter of a wealthy California family. The possibility of marrying into a local fortune was a very real fantasy for many immigrant Anglos, if their diaries from the time are to be credited. Whether Halleck's comment did the trick or not, the vote was carried in favor of female property rights. The final piece of evidence pointing to Doña Angustias' effect on the delegates is the gift they made her of a pen they used to sign the final document. The symbolism of that gift implies a recognition by the delegates of De la Guerra's political influence. Clearly, Doña Angustias was not a woman to be kept quiet while men stuff was being discussed. The importance of large ranches and their attendant social organizations to the exercise of power in Mexican California meant that women like Angustias could expect to play a large role in the political life of their society. When Anglos maintained and even expanded ranching culture in the U.S. West, they reinforced the oligarchic power structures that came with large-scale ranching, structures that afforded elite women significant agency. By way of conclusion, I'd like to return to my introductory comments in which I drew a comparison between the fictional Leslie Benedict and the very real Cornelia Adair. Perhaps the more historically relevant pairing, however, would be Angustias de la Guerra, the figurative First Lady of transitional California, and her literal counterpart, Margaret Taylor, wife of the President of the United States at the time of California statehood. Mrs. Taylor actively avoided any participation in her husband's political career, going so far as to relinquish her White House hosting responsibilities to their daughter. A more striking contrast with the politically and socially hyperactive de la Guerra could not be imagined. Of the two, Doña Angustias, it would seem, was the more significant cultural ancestor of ranching heiresses such as our own Helen DeWitt Jones. Or, we might even say, that of the strong Western woman who we would frame as the matriarch of our new Humanities Center enterprise, the redoubtable Dr. Thank you.
Okay, so we have at least 5 minutes for questions, so I'll open it up to all of you. If everyone wants to ask. Andrew.
You made a comparison between Margaret Taylor and
Angustias de la Guerra.
yes. Do you think that the performativity of all of that had anything to do with Margaret Taylor being sort of at the pinnacle and having to at least take part in these rituals and things to consolidate and keep her power?
Well, it's interesting. There's these stories about Margaret Taylor, who says that when in the middle of the race for the presidency, in which you would expect a political wife would be doing her most to try to get her man elected, she actually actively prayed that he would lose so much that she did not. The interesting thing, another interesting thing about Margaret Taylor is that she was born on a Maryland plantation. She was a Maryland plantation owner's daughter. And the character of Leslie Benedict in Giant is essentially the daughter of a Maryland plantation owner. And the whole idea, that scene in Giant is this strong Eastern woman comes to Texas and doesn't like it that women aren't allowed to speak about politics. When the reality is the real Maryland daughter in the White House didn't want anything to do with politics at all, and because Western women are much more sort of used to it. That's so. I don't know if that answers your question about Margaret Taylor.
So it seems that there is very much an Anglo model and a Mexican model of how women are supposed to behave in society and their property rights, especially. Does this Mexican model trace back to Spain at all? Because I find that hard to believe, but I was wondering if there's any.
Yeah, there was some, when I delivered this as part of our sort of practice session, people were asking me what the link was to ranching culture in Mexico, which I'm not entirely certain about. The interesting thing about California is that all of that land that you saw sort of being divided up didn't happen until after California became independent of Spain along with the rest of Mexico.
Okay.
And so there's a lot written about the power of the relative power of elite women in Spanish California. And at one point, the governor's wife was actually thrown in jail because she was doing something that the governor didn't like. So my sort of argument is that this particular kind of power relationship and the female's role in it actually doesn't come about until all that land gets divided up into ranches after independence. But a lot of people were telling me at this event before that there's all kinds of ranches, especially in northern Mexico. There's this sort of whole tradition of strong women running ranches and so on. So that's one of the connections that I have not fully explored yet.
Gary, and then Jenny, if we have enough time.
Sure.
Yeah.
I can think of a couple of examples. One of them, these are not necessarily contemporaneous in time, but like Water for Chocolate, which has a very strong woman who's running a ranch.
Right.
And the other one is from Venezuela, and it's the novel Doña Barbara, which also features a very strong ranch operating woman.
Okay, thank you.
Well, and
Quick.
it seems to me that, really quick observation, that the person you really want to look at is the Benedict sister, is Luz, who is a strong ranching woman, and actually who, leaving, I know the movie really well, she leaves the part of the land to James Dean and changes the entire dynamic, right? I mean,
Right.
she dies for her, she gets killed off for her strength, right? But she is, I mean, it seems to me that she's actually it's the Eastern Western. Now, it's not necessarily gendered, or if it is, it's kind of complicated, because she actually does have a lot to say in the running of the ranch, doesn't she?
Yeah, which is why it's in that particular scene,
Right.
she is set with, there's another woman in the house, I can't remember, who's sort of set off to the side doing her knitting while the men are talking.
Vashti, the wife of the neighbor.
And she, and Elizabeth Taylor has to sort of, and in fact, when she's dealing with the men, turns around and does some sort of at the women or something like that. So in that moment, Luz is put off to the side, and I think she might be the one who says, when Elizabeth Taylor has a problem, she might be the one who says, I'm going to go up and go to bed, honey. And her husband says, yeah, go. So it's really weird that in that moment, they make her really passive.
Yeah,
I don't know why.
yeah.